Welcome to Midnight Histories, where sleepy truths pull you into stories you never expected. Imagine that, you swiping right, but your father already swiped for you 10 years before you hit puberty. Today, love is a story of butterflies, midnight texts, and soft kisses in rain. Back then, love was irrelevant. Marriage was a contract, a transaction between families, a careful trade of cows, land, and alliances, ensuring your family's survival in a brutal, uncertain world. You think heartbreak is tough? Try marrying someone you've met once, or not at all, because your parents promised you at age 7. Weddings weren't the climax of a love story. They were the opening scene in a lifelong contract to produce heirs, expand fields, and fortify family honor. Happiness was never the point. Security was. Your feelings didn't matter. Your dowry did. In a world where famine could arrive with the next frost, and the plague could empty entire villages, marriage was a shield, a ladder, a currency of survival. And so, in the Middle Ages, love was not the rosy promise of today. It was a necessity dressed in ceremony, sealed with ale and whispered prayers, as you stepped into a life you never chose. If you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe, so we have more motivation to produce better quality products. And now, let's step into that world. Chapter 1, when love wasn't important. In the Middle Ages, no one was waiting for butterflies, and the heart was not trusted with decisions of consequence. Marriage was not about your feelings. It was about duty, survival, and the heavy weight of family legacy pressing down upon your shoulders before you could even lift a hoe or sew a seam. Picture a cold morning in a village wrapped in mist. Chickens scuttle across the dirt yard. A dog barks in the distance, and a mother calls her children to rise, for work begins at dawn. Somewhere inside a timber-frame cottage, a young girl rubs sleep from her eyes. She is 12, perhaps 13, but her future has already been decided. Her father has spoken of family in the next hamlet, the family that owns the field bordering theirs, and an agreement has been made. They will merge their land, ensuring a slightly larger harvest, a slightly greater chance to survive the next harsh winter. The daughter will be wed, and she will not refuse, because there is nothing to refuse. In the Middle Ages, marriage was a family duty, a sacred contract that tied two households into one fragile alliance. It was a means of extending influence and preserving property in a world where land was life itself. If your family lost land, you lost your ability to feed your animals, to grow the grain that would keep you alive for the cold months, to provide dowries for your other children, to pay tithes to the church and taxes to your Lord. Marriage was a shield against these losses, and each child was a piece on a chessboard that parents moved carefully, hoping to checkmate famine, plague, and debt before these harsh kings claimed the family's future. Imagine a young man, a second or third son, in a modest family. He knows he will not inherit his father's lands. Those will go to the eldest, as is right and proper. His future lies in a good marriage, one that will bring him into a new household where he can farm, where he can build a modest claim of his own to the labor of his hands. Love has no part in these calculations. His parents will speak with neighbors, with relatives in nearby villages, seeking a girl whose family might need a strong worker, whose dowry might include a cow or a parcel of land, or a share in a mill's income. Love stories were for troubadours to sing, for jesters to amuse the bored nobility. For most, the business of marriage was conducted in whispers over the low fence between gardens, sealed with handshakes and nods at the local church door. And the nobility? Their marriages were even less about love, if that can be imagined. A young lord's marriage was a diplomatic mission, a calculated move on the grand chessboard of medieval politics. Marrying the daughter of a neighboring baron could mean peace between two families who had feuded for generations. It could bring control of a vital river crossing, the promise of knights in times of war, or the consolidation of manors that doubled a family's wealth in a single generation. The stakes were high, and the emotions of the young lord and lady were as irrelevant as the flicker of a candle in a storm. It is easy to romanticize the past, to imagine princesses pining for love, young knights risking everything for a lady's favor. Yet, beneath the poetry and the courtly dances, the reality was often harsh. A princess might be promised in marriage to a prince in a distant land before she was even born, her body and her future traded for an alliance that would protect her father's kingdom from invaders. She would be sent to live among strangers, to bear children for a man she barely knew, to maintain a polite smile as she navigated the intricate, often dangerous politics of foreign court. Her happiness was never the point. Stability was. In the towns, among the emerging merchant classes, marriage was a means of securing trade alliances, expanding business networks, and merging wealth to build stronger family ventures. A merchant might marry his daughter to the son of a wool dealer, securing favorable terms for his cloth. A baker might marry his son to the daughter of a miller, ensuring a steady supply of flour for his ovens. Love, if it appeared, was a pleasant surprise, a blessing from God rather than an expectation. Even the church, that great guardian of morality, viewed marriage through the lens of duty. It preached the importance of the sacrament, of the solemn vows made before God, but it did not require or expect love to precede these vows. It was enough that the couple consented, that the families approved, that the union served the stability of the community. The church discouraged the hot flames of passion, warning that love could blind the faithful to their duties, could lead them into sin and folly. Marriage was for the purpose of procreation, for the maintenance of the social order, for the fulfillment of God's will on earth. If affection came in time, it was well. If it did not, the marriage continued regardless. In this world, young people learned to suppress their desires, to place family duty above personal longing. They were taught to respect the decisions of their elders, who had the wisdom to secure alliances, to see the dangers that individual desires might overlook. A girl might dream of a kind husband, a boy might hope for a gentle wife, but they did not demand these things. They prayed for them quietly, but they did not rebel when a match was made without such comforts. They knew that survival was a hard master, that hunger and exposure were fiercer enemies than loneliness. And so, in the Middle Ages, the heart learned its place. It beat quietly beneath layers of wool and linen, beneath the heavy weight of responsibility, beneath the knowledge that each marriage was a gamble against death and poverty. A marriage might bring prosperity, security, the hope of healthy children who would survive to adulthood. It might fail, leaving a widow to struggle with debts, a family to divide and weaken. But in all cases, it was a duty, a transaction that tied families together in the shared struggle for survival. We often imagine the past as a place of romance, of simpler times when love was true and life was pure. But when you walk the muddy roads of medieval village, past the smoke rising from low cottages and the bell ringing from the church tower, you see that the simplicity was not soft, nor was it gentle. It was a simplicity born of necessity, of the constant knowledge that every decision carried weight, that each choice could mean the difference between comfort and suffering, between survival and death. Marriage was one of the heaviest of these decisions. It was not made lightly, and it was not made for love. It was made because it had to be made, because the land needed to be secured, because the family needed to grow, because the village needed to remain strong against the threats that lurked beyond the safety of its hedges and fields. It was a decision shaped by hunger, by cold, by the knowledge that the world was a dangerous place, and that unity, however it was achieved, was a form of protection. As we lay down now to rest, let's imagine quiet of that medieval night. The fields are dark, the air is cold, and in the cottages, families sleep side by side for warmth. A newly married couple lies on a straw mattress, perhaps speaking softly to each other, learning the contours of a stranger's breath, the rhythm of a stranger's heart. They may find affection in time, they may not, but they will rise tomorrow to work the land together, to face the challenges of their world as one, because that is what marriage means in their time. Let your breath slow as you think of these quiet cottages, of the duty that bound people together when love was a rare luxury. In a world without choice, there was a certain peace and acceptance in the knowledge that your path was chosen for you, that your life was a small part of family's hope for survival. Sleep now, and let the past drift around you like the mist in the fields, soft and cold, whispering of a time when love was not important, but duty was everything. In that medieval dawn, when love was not a consideration and marriage was duty, another quiet truth shaped every family's future. Land, dowries, and alliances were worth more than any tender feeling, any hopeful glance exchanged across a field. Imagine your parents discussing your future over a thin gruel breakfast in a smoky, dimly lit cottage. The pot hangs over the hearth, and the children eat in silence, While outside, a rooster crows into the pale dawn. There is frost on the grass, and the family's cow shifts in the byre, lowing softly. It is in these simple mornings that parents would speak in hushed tones, planning not for love stories, but for alliances that might add a strip of land to the family's holdings, or secure an agreement for a plow ox when the old one died, or bring in a daughter-in-law whose dowry included 2 milk goats, adding warmth to the cold mornings and butter to the bread. You may think of dowries as something grand, bags of gold and precious jewels. But for most medieval families, dowries were practical. A small piece of land, a few animals, household tools, a set of linen, or a modest sum of coins tied in a leather pouch. Each item represented labor, sacrifice, and survival. A young woman's dowry was her ticket into marriage, a contribution to the new household, and a promise to the groom's family that she brought value to the hard life ahead. It was a heavy expectation, one placed on girls in the moment they could understand the whispered conversations around them, when they watched their mothers setting aside cloth or collecting coins, slowly gathering the pieces that would form a dowry one day. In noble households, the scale was larger, but the principle was the same. Land was power. A baron seeking to secure a marriage for his daughter did so with calculation, not sentiment, whose lands bordered his own, which alliances could strengthen his family's standing in the realm, which dowries would bring the most profit, or the strongest shield against rivals. A daughter's marriage could mean the difference between peace and a feud, between prosperity and ruin. If the bride was fortunate, the match would bring a kind husband, but kindness was never part of negotiations. Marriage was a transaction in every sense. It was discussed by fathers and uncles, sometimes with mothers present, but rarely with the young couple themselves. In many cases, a betrothal would be arranged when the children were still small, as early as 5 or 6 years old among the nobility, with formal contracts sealed by witnesses to ensure that neither family could later break the promise without consequence. A broken betrothal could mean lawsuits, feuds, or even violence, for it was not just a promise between 2 children, but a legally binding agreement between 2 families seeking to secure their future. Even among peasants, who had fewer legal formalities, promises were taken seriously. A spoken agreement in front of witnesses, a handshake between fathers, was often enough to set the path of 2 young lives. The dowry, modest as it might be, was discussed in careful detail. The value of the land, the health of the animals, the timing of the payment. It was not uncommon for disputes over dowries to be brought before the manor court, where the local lord or his steward would settle the matter. For dowries were not gifts, they were investments, and the bride price, a payment from the groom's family to the bride's, was also common in some regions. It was a recognition of the loss of the daughter's labor to her natal family, compensation for the hands that would now work another family's fields, tend another family's hearth. The marriage was not simply the joining of 2 people, but a complex economic arrangement, balancing the needs and resources of 2 households, ensuring that both could continue their daily struggle against hunger, cold, and the uncertainty of life. In this world, young people did not dream of love matches. They prayed for matches that would not bring hardship, for spouses who would not be cruel, for in-laws who would treat them with kindness. If love came later, it was a blessing, but it was never the expectation. The expectation was that each would do their duty, the wife to bear children and manage the household, the husband to work the land and protect the family, both to contribute to the survival of their families in a world where one bad harvest, one illness, one harsh winter could change everything. Dowries and alliances were also a means of protection. A woman with sufficient dowry could secure a safer marriage, one in which she was less likely to be mistreated, for she brought value that could not be easily dismissed. A family with strong alliances could call upon neighbors for help in times of need, could rely on kinship ties to protect them in disputes, to assist them during illness or scarcity. Marriage was a weaving of a web of obligation, creating bonds that extended beyond the couple, linking entire communities in networks of support that could mean the difference between survival and ruin. Imagine a medieval village, its small cluster of cottages surrounded by fields. Each family knows its neighbors, knows who is kin, who owes whom a favor, who can be relied upon when the sow is farrowing in the night or when the harvest must be brought in before the rains come. Marriage was a way of strengthening these ties, of ensuring that when you needed help, someone would come, because you had married your daughter to their son, because your grandson was their grandson, because the bond of marriage extended into the community's fabric. It is easy from the comfort of the present to look back and see these arrangements as cold, unfeeling, a betrayal of the human desire for love. Yet for those who lived in the Middle Ages, these transactions were acts of care, of hope, of protection. Parents arranged marriages not because they wished to deny their children happiness, but because they wished to ensure their children's survival. In a world where death was never far, where a single bad season could bring hunger, where violence and disease were constant threats, love was a luxury. Survival was a necessity, and marriage, with its dowries and alliances, was one of the few tools parents had to safeguard their families' futures. So, as you drift towards sleep, imagine the quiet of that medieval village at dusk, the smoke rising from the hearths, the soft lowing of cattle, the creak of the cottage doors as families gather inside. A father sits near the fire, discussing the terms of marriage with a neighbor, while the children sit quietly listening, knowing that one day, they too will be part of these conversations. A mother folds a piece of linen, sets aside a jar of honey, tucks away a small coin, each piece a part of the dowry that will one day help her daughter find a place in the world. There is comfort in these small acts, in the knowledge that in a world of uncertainty, each family did what they could to protect their own, to build a fragile security against the darkness outside. And while love may not have been the reason for these marriages, the hope for peace, for stability, for a future was there, woven quietly into each agreement, each whispered conversation, each promise made in the dim light of dawn. They say love should come first, that you should follow your heart and trust it will lead you to the right person, that romance is a foundation of a happy life. But in the Middle Ages, love before marriage was not only rare, it was often viewed with suspicion, even fear. In a world ruled by necessity, strong family ties, and economic survival, love was a luxury that could cause chaos if allowed to interfere with duty. Imagine you are a young woman in a small medieval village. You rise before dawn to sweep the hearth, milk the goat, and carry water from the well while mist curls over the fields. You glance across the path and see a young man you have known since childhood, helping his father prepare the plow. Perhaps you share a smile, a brief moment of warmth in a cold, duty-bound world. But you know that your family may already have other plans for you, and his family may be negotiating with another household for his future. The feelings that blossom quietly in your heart are not something you can act upon. To do so would be to challenge the fragile order that keeps your family safe. Romantic love, as we imagine today, was often considered reckless. To marry for love was to ignore the careful negotiations that protected property, alliances, and family honor. A son who fell in love with a poor girl from another village might bring shame upon his family, weakening their position and risking the loss of land or dowry. A daughter who fell in love with a young man who could not offer the proper bride price might find herself in disgrace, her family burdened with the consequences of her choices. Love, with all its unpredictability, was dangerous. Among the nobility, the stakes were even higher. A young lord who fell in love with a woman of lower status threatened not only his family's reputation, but also its political alliances. A noble woman who allowed herself to be swayed by passion risked bringing scandal upon her household, and with scandal came ruin. The love stories of the medieval period, Tristan and Isolde, Lancelot and Guinevere, were tragedies for a reason. They were cautionary tales, reminders that love could lead to destruction, betrayal, and war. These stories were not models to follow, but warnings whispered by firelight. Even the church, which celebrated marriage as a sacrament, was wary of love that burned too brightly. Passion was seen as a temptation, something that could lead to sin and disrupt the harmony of a marriage that was meant to be practical and stable. The ideal was a calm affection that might grow within the structure of marriage, not the fiery desire that could drive people to defy their families and the church's guidance. Marriage, then, was not about feelings but about order, community stability, and family survival. When young people did fall in love before marriage, they were often forced to suppress their feelings or hope that their families would see the match as beneficial. Secret courtships could lead to scandal, and elopements were rare and dangerous, often resulting in the couple being ostracized or punished. It was not that medieval people were incapable of love, but that they lived within a system where love had to wait its turn behind more pressing concerns. In towns and villages, people knew that the world was harsh and survival uncertain. Love could not feed a family, plow a field, or protect against illness. Marriage was a means of creating a partnership that could endure the hardships of life. And feelings, if they came, were considered a blessing rather than a requirement. Parents advised their children to look for spouses who were kind and hardworking. But even these qualities were secondary to the economic and social benefits a match could bring. Imagine the quiet conversations between parents in a small house at night, the fire burning low, the children asleep on straw pallets. They speak of a neighbor's son who needs a wife, of a daughter who is reaching the age where marriage is expected, of dowries and fields, of cows and goats. They speak not with coldness, but with a deep concern for their children's future, knowing that a good marriage could mean the difference between security and hardship. Love, if it was mentioned at all, was a hope, a soft wish spoken quietly, never the foundation of their plans. This is not to say that medieval people were loveless or cold. They found moments of affection within their marriages, moments of connection and partnership. There were couples who grew to love each other deeply over time, who found joy in each other's company as they worked side by side in the fields or tended their children. Love could grow in the fertile ground of shared labor and mutual respect, but was a seed that often sprouted after the marriage vows had been exchanged, not before. In this world, the rare stories of love before marriage stood out, whispered about in villages and recorded in ballads. A young couple who defied their families and ran away together became the subject of songs, their stories passed down through generations as both warnings and dreams. These tales allowed people to imagine a world where love could triumph over duty, but they remained stories, distant from the daily reality of life in the Middle Ages. As you lie in the quiet of your room, letting your breathing slow, imagine the soft darkness of a medieval night, the glow of hearth fires flickering through cracks in cottage walls, the low murmur of parents discussing their children's futures. Feel the calm way of a world where each decision was made with care, where feelings were carefully placed behind the needs of the family, where love was a hope rather than an expectation. Let yourself drift into sleep, knowing that in that world, every marriage was a step toward survival, a promise to face the harshness of life together, whether love came or not. If the medieval world viewed love before marriage as dangerous, it regarded the church's role in marriage with solemn, unyielding seriousness. The church was not a bystander in the matter of who you married or how you lived afterward. It was a gatekeeper, the witness, the enforcer of morality, and a quiet overseer reminding everyone that marriage was not about desire but about duty, stability, and the eternal salvation of souls. In your world today, you might choose to marry under a flower arch on a beach or in a quiet registry office with soft music playing in the background. For medieval people, marriage was a sacrament, as holy as baptism and communion, and the church's blessing was essential for its legitimacy in the eyes of God and the community. Without that blessing, a marriage could be considered invalid. Children born from it labeled illegitimate, unable to inherit land or property, a disaster in a world where land was life. Picture a small village church, its stone walls cold and thick, a single bell above the arched wooden door. Inside, the air smells of old incense and damp straw brought in on the boots of villagers who kneel on the hard floor, whispering prayers as a thin light filters through stained glass. It is here that marriages are confirmed, in front of the priest who represents the divine authority of the church, who ensures that vows are exchanged properly and that the marriage is lawful. But despite its seriousness, the church's position on marriage was often practical. It knew that marriage was an economic and social necessity, and that communities could not function without stable family units. The church recognized marriages that were entered into freely by both parties, even if they were arranged by families, as long as there was at least verbal consent from the bride and groom. It was less concerned with whether love was present than whether the marriage fulfilled its intended role to create legitimate unions, produce children, and provide a moral structure that kept communities stable. The church was clear in its teaching. Marriage was for procreation, to prevent sin, and provide companionship in that order. Passionate love, that fiery desire celebrated in ballads and whispered in secret, was seen as something to be wary of, for it could lead to impulsive decisions and, worse, to sin outside the boundaries of a lawful union. Priests would warn against the dangers of lust, reminding young people that marriage was not to satisfy fleeting desires, but to fulfill a duty to God and family. Even the timing of marriages often revolved around the church calendar. Weddings were prohibited during certain holy seasons, such as Lent and Advent, and families would plan marriages around these restrictions, ensuring that the union would not draw God's disapproval. The marriage itself would typically take place on the church steps, a public declaration in front of the community, followed by the blessing of the priest. The couple would then step inside the church for Mass, sealing their vows in the presence of the divine. The church's involvement did not end with the ceremony. It provided guidance on the roles of husbands and wives, reminding men of their duty to care for their wives and families, and instructing women on obedience and the importance of managing the household with diligence and faith. The church enforced moral behavior within marriage, condemning cruelty, infidelity, and abandonment, though enforcement could be uneven, and the practical realities of medieval life often meant that ideals and reality were not always aligned. In disputes over marriages, dowries, or legitimacy, the church courts often became involved. A woman abandoned by her husband could appeal to the ecclesiastical court, seeking restitution or the enforcement of her marriage rights. Disagreements over dowry payments or contested marriages could end up before a bishop's court, where decisions were made not only according to law, but also according to the moral standards set by the church. The church's authority over marriage also served as a form of protection for women, albeit limited by the customs of the time. While it upheld the authority of husbands, it also condemned unjust treatment of wives and emphasized a spiritual partnership that marriage was meant to represent. It taught that a husband and wife were to support each other, to live together in faith and mutual respect, and to raise their children in the teachings of the church. This spiritual partnership did not mean equality in the modern sense, but it was a reminder that marriage was more than a transaction of property and alliances. It was also a spiritual commitment, a vow made before God, one that would extend beyond the harsh realities of daily survival. For many medieval people, the spiritual dimension provided comfort, reminding them that their struggles within marriage were part of a larger divine plan, that their sacrifices and labors were seen and valued by God. And so, in the medieval world, the church stood as both a guardian and a guide, overseeing the institution of marriage with solemn presence that shaped every aspect of family life. It was a quiet voice reminding the community that while marriages might be arranged for land, dowries, and alliances, they were also sacred, meant to uphold the moral fabric of society and to guide souls toward salvation. As you drift toward rest, let your mind wander to the small stone churches scattered across the medieval landscape, their bells ringing softly over the fields at dawn, calling villagers to prayer. Imagine the quiet of those mornings, the hush of the congregation as a couple exchanges vows on the church steps, the priest's hand raised in blessing as the cold air drifts through the open door. In those moments, the community witnessed not just a union of two people, but the weaving of another thread into the fabric of survival, faith, and duty that held their world together. In the Middle Ages, love was not required, but the church's blessing was. For marriage was a cornerstone upon which the fragile structures of family, community, and faith were built. It was a promise that even in a world filled with hardship and uncertainty, there was order, purpose, and a path towards something greater than the struggle of daily life. Sleep now, under the gentle echo of church bells in your imagination, remembering that in a world where love was rare, the vow made before God was a light that guided countless souls through the darkness of their daily burdens, offering them hope, structure, and a quiet, solemn form of comfort. Chapter 2. Betrothals in Childhood, Children and Promises. In your world, childhood is a time of gentle mornings, soft toys, and the warm glow of bedtime stories. But in the Middle Ages, childhood was brief, shadowed by the weight of duty, and sometimes ended with a promise spoken before the child even knew what it meant. A betrothal arranged long before the child could understand the meaning of love, marriage, or the expectations quietly placed upon small shoulders. Imagine a small medieval village at dawn, the mist still clinging to the thatched rooftops, a rooster crowing as the first light breaks across frost-tipped grass. In a timber-framed cottage, a girl of 5 sits beside her mother, weaving small pieces of wool into her hair, while her brothers prepare to follow their father into the fields. She is young, her cheeks round with the softness of childhood, her eyes bright with curiosity. She does not know that today, Her father will walk across the village green to speak with another man, that over the sound of the church bell ringing for morning prayers, her future will quietly be decided. In the medieval world, betrothals in childhood were not rare. They were a practical necessity. For noble families, these promises were tools of diplomacy and survival, binding powerful houses together, securing peace, alliances, and land. For peasant families, they were a means to ensure the future of a small plot of earth, to secure help for the coming years, to protect against the long shadow of uncertainty that hung over every family. Children, in this world, were part of the family's plan for survival. A daughter could bring in a dowry that would allow her family to pay debts or acquire an additional strip of farmland. A son's marriage could secure a partnership that would help bring in a harvest, care for aging parents, or strengthen family bond with neighbors in times of scarcity. These decisions were made with care, not cruelty, in quiet conversations held by candlelight after the children had gone to sleep, in whispered words exchanged near hedgerows, or in the low shadows of a church porch. In noble families, betrothals were often arranged when children were as young as 5 or 6, with formal contracts signed and witnessed to ensure that the agreement was binding. The promise of marriage was not a light commitment. It was a solemn pact that could carry heavy consequences if broken. Families relied on these promises to secure peace between rival houses, to merge lands, or to protect against political threats. The betrothal of a child was a pledge that the family would honor, even if it meant sending a daughter far away when she was old enough to marry, to live among strangers, to fulfill a promise she never chose to make. Among peasants, the formalities might have been fewer, but the seriousness of the promise remained. A handshake between fathers, a promise exchanged before witnesses in the village, was often enough to set the path for 2 young lives. The agreement might involve a modest dowry, a goat, a piece of land, a share of the harvest, and a promise that when the children reached the appropriate age, they would marry and join their families together. For the children, these promises often existed in the background of their lives, like the steady rhythm of the seasons, unspoken yet understood. A girl might grow up knowing that she was promised a boy in the neighboring cottage, their lives weaving together through the daily tasks of childhood, carrying water from the well, gathering firewood, tending sheep on the common land, never questioning the path set before them. A boy might watch his father and the girl's father discussing the harvest, trading goods, or helping each other mend fences, knowing that one day, these quiet alliances would become his responsibility, and that the girl he played with would one day be his wife. The church, in its role as the guardian of marriage, often recognized these betrothals as binding, as long as there was eventual consent when the children came of age. But the idea of consent was complex in a world where duty outweighed desire, and where refusing a match arranged by one's family could lead to conflict, shame, or even violence. The child, now grown, might stand before the church with trembling hands, repeating vows that had been expected for as long as they could remember, stepping into a life they did not choose, but one that was chosen for the sake of family and survival. This was not always seen as a tragedy by those who lived it. In a world where life was harsh, where each winter could bring hunger, where illness could sweep through a village without warning, the security of a planned future brought a form of comfort. Parents believed they were protecting their children, ensuring that they would not be left without support, that they would have a household to join, land to work, and a community that recognized their place within it. These promises were made with love, even if love itself was not the reason for marriage. And sometimes within these betrothals, affection did grow. Children who grew up knowing they would one day marry might find comfort in each other's presence, a quiet bond forming through the shared experiences of daily life. A boy might watch the girl he was promised to as she carried water from the well, her hair catching the light of the morning sun, and feel a soft stirring of affection that would grow over the years. A girl might see the boy working in the fields, his back bent beneath the weight of labor, and feel gratitude that he would one day be her partner in the same work. Love, if it came, was a blessing, but never an expectation. These childhood promises were threads in the fabric of medieval life, woven quietly into the structure that held families and communities together. They were made in faith, in hope, in the belief that a secure future was worth the sacrifice of choice, that duty was a form of love that might not be understood by the heart, but was deeply felt by the soul. As you close your eyes and let your breathing slow, imagine the soft hush of a medieval dawn, The quiet moments in cottages where parents whispered about futures, about promises made to protect their children in a world that could be unkind. Imagine the small hands of children clasping each other as they walk across a field, unaware of the path that has already been chosen for them, living in the gentle simplicity of childhood that will end not with sudden break, but with a quiet step into a life of duty. In that world, promises made in childhood were not burdens to be resented, but were seen as a necessary part of life, a form of protection against the storms that life would inevitably bring. Sleep now, and let the past settle around you like a soft blanket, carrying you into dreams of misty mornings and quiet villages, where children lived under the shadow of promises spoken with hope, in a time when love was a quiet wish, and duty was a promise that shaped their lives. While the promise of marriage in childhood hovered softly over many medieval homes, the reality behind these betrothals was practical, grounded, and as constant as the changing seasons. Marriage contracts often stood in place of courtship, shaping lives long before love could even attempt to bloom. Imagine a small wooden table in a candle-lit room, a piece of parchment resting between two fathers, their rough hands ink-stained as they press seals into soft wax. Outside, the wind hums low through cracks in the timber walls, carrying the scent of damp earth and wood smoke, while the children they speak of are asleep in the loft above, dreaming of small things, climbing trees, feeding chickens, splashing in a stream. They do not know that while they sleep, their paths are being carefully and quietly laid out in ink and wax. In medieval Europe, formal marriage contracts were a cornerstone of the betrothal process, a practice that blurred the line between personal choice and family strategy. These agreements documented the terms of the future union, detailing the dowry to be provided by the bride's family, the bride price or property settlements from the groom's family, and the specific conditions under which the marriage would take place. For the families, these documents were shields, protecting their interests in a world where disputes over land and inheritance could fracture entire communities. Among the nobility, these contracts were meticulously crafted, sometimes negotiated over months, even years. Lawyers and clerics might be called in to witness and record the agreements, ensuring that every clause was clear, that every condition was acceptable to both sides. A noble father would consider the value of the land offered, the alliances promised, and the reputation of the family seeking the marriage. A noble mother might consider the health of the bride, her ability to bear children, her suitability to manage a household that can include dozens of servants and tenants. These contracts replaced the concept of courtship, which we often romanticize today as a gentle dance of smiles and letters, of long walks and shy glances. In the medieval world, particularly for those with land or titles to protect, there was little room for such luxuries. The dance was one of negotiation, of careful balancing of property, alliances, and a hope for peace between families whose disputes could turn deadly if left unresolved. For merchant families in growing towns, marriage contracts were no less important. As trade expanded and the merchant class rose in influence, marriages became a means to secure economic partnerships. A baker's daughter might be promised to a miller's son, ensuring a steady supply of flour for the baker's ovens. A weaver's son might marry the daughter of a dyer, solidifying a business relationship that would benefit both families for years to come. The contracts would include details of what goods or funds would accompany the bride, what the groom's family would provide in return, and how these exchanges would support the newly formed household. In peasant communities, while fewer formal documents were created, the verbal agreements were no less binding. Witnesses, often respected elders in the village, would be present during discussions between families, ensuring that the promises were made openly and with clear understanding. A simple exchange, "Your daughter will marry my son when they are of age, and in return, we will provide a cow and a share in the harvest," could set the course of two lives of the same weight as a written contract among the nobility. These marriage contracts also served as a form of protection, particularly for women, within the limits of medieval society. By formalizing the terms of the marriage, the contract provided some security that the agreed dowry would be honored, that the bride would be treated according to the expectations set during negotiations, and that the union would proceed in a way that benefited both families. In a world where disputes over property and inheritance could lead to violence, having the terms of marriage clearly documented was a way to prevent conflicts that could tear apart communities. The negotiation of these contracts was often accompanied by feasting and quiet celebration, marking the agreement as a moment of hope. Families would share bread and ale, shaking hands as they confirmed the terms, looking ahead to the future with cautious optimism. The children, if present, might not fully understand the significance of the occasion, but they would remember the smiles of their parents, the warmth of the fire, the way the adults spoke of the future with a rare softness in their voices. But behind the warmth was a recognition of the serious nature of these agreements. Breaking a betrothal was no small matter. It could lead to lawsuits in manorial or ecclesiastical courts, with damages sought for the losses incurred by the broken promise. In some cases, breaking an engagement could escalate into feuds between families, a single broken promise igniting long-standing tensions that had waited for an excuse to surface. The contract, therefore, was not simply a plan for a wedding. It was a promise that tied families together for better or worse. The system of contracts, of promises made in childhood and sealed in adolescence, meant that love, if it came, was something that happened within the framework already built by others. Couples might grow to care for each other deeply, might find companionship and even affection in their shared lives. But these feelings were expected to develop after the marriage, nurtured through the daily acts of partnership, of shared labor, and the raising of children. Love was a tender flower, but the soil in which it grew was a practical, structured world of agreements and obligations. As you lie quietly, letting your mind drift, picture the soft glow of candlelight in a medieval cottage, the quiet voices of parents discussing futures with neighbors, the slow signing of a document that would guide the course of two young lives. Imagine the children, unaware of the ink drying on parchment, playing together outside in the last light of the day, their laughter echoing against the stone walls of their village, living in a moment of freedom that would one day narrow into the path chosen for them. Sleep now, letting the weight of the past settle gently around you, understanding that in a world where survival was uncertain, marriage contracts were not chains meant to oppress, but lifelines thrown across the harsh sea of medieval life, holding families together in a hope of future where they might weather the storms to come. In the medieval world, negotiations over dowries, land, and political gain were not cold transactions devoid of feeling, but rather careful strategies for family survival, protection, and quiet ambition. It was in these whispered agreements across rough wooden tables, in the nods exchanged at church doors after Mass, that parents wove a safety net against the ever-present threats of hunger, illness, and social decline. Imagine the stone hearth flickering in a low cottage, the sweet, smoky scent of burning peat filling the small room as a mother stitches a patch onto her child's tunic. Outside, the wind sweeps across fields that have fed the family for generations, fields that can be lost in a single bad harvest or a sudden illness. It is here, by the glow of the fire, that parents speak softly about the future, about the marriage that might secure another strip of land, the dowry that might bring a cow or sheep, the alliance that could mean an extra pair of hands when the harvest comes. For peasant families, dowries often included practical items: a goat for milk, a cow for plowing and butter, a small plot of land to expand a garden, or tools that would help a young couple build their household. These were not simply gifts. They were investments into the new family unit, ensuring the couple had the resources to survive and contribute to the larger family network. Parents who worked hard to save these dowries did so out of love, a quiet, practical love that sought to protect their children in a world where every meal depended on hard labor and the mercy of the seasons. Land, in particular, was a currency of survival. A small strip added to a family's holdings could mean more grain to store for the winter, more pasture for sheep, or more space for planting vegetables that would feed children through the cold months. Families would negotiate marriages with neighbors whose fields bordered their own, merging plots to reduce boundary disputes and strengthen their collective resilience against hunger. A marriage was not just a union of two young people. It was a union of fields, of fences, of work, and of shared futures. Among the nobility, these negotiations took on a grander scale, but with the same intentions. A baron with 3 daughters might carefully arrange their marriages to secure political alliances that would protect his lands from rival claims. A lord with an only son might seek a wealthy heiress whose dowry would bring not just gold but also lands, castles, and the loyalty of knights. The discussions could last for months, involving priests, scribes, and legal advisors to ensure every detail was noted and agreed upon, with documents sealed in wax and marked with family crests that signified centuries of pride and power. These negotiations were also about protection. A daughter's dowry was her shield, ensuring that she would not be discarded easily. For do so would mean the husband's family would forfeit the dowry or face social and legal consequences. The dowry was a sign of the family's investment in their daughter's future and a reminder that she was not alone, that her family support extended beyond the walls of her new home. It was a mother's hope, a father's promise, stitched into seams of linen shift, stored in the clink of coins in a small chest, or marked by the healthy calf tied with rope outside the cottage on the day she left for her new life. Political gain was not merely about power. It was about stability. In a world where kingdoms rose and fell through marriage alliances, a well-negotiated marriage could bring peace to warring families or secure a claim that would protect generations to come. These alliances were delicate, requiring skillful navigation of pride, honor, and ambition. A misstep could mean conflict, while a careful agreement could ensure years of cooperation, the merging of armies, and the quiet promise that the family's name would endure. In many cases, young people were present during these negotiations, learning early that their lives were intertwined with the needs of their families and communities. A daughter might help her mother prepare the cloth that would be part of her dowry, folding each piece carefully, understanding that each fold was a step toward the future. A son might stand beside his father, watching as the older men shook hands, learning that manhood was not just about strength but about responsibility, duty, and the wisdom to protect those under his care. These negotiations, though practical, often carried a quiet hope. Families wished for good matches, for kindness between the young couple, for a household that would be marked by peace rather than conflict. Parents would pray that the daughter they sent to another household would find respect and gentle treatment, that the son who welcomed a bride would find in her a partner who would share his burdens, ease his labors, and bring warmth to cold winter nights. It is easy to look back on these arrangements with modern eyes and see them as harsh, but within the medieval world, they were acts of care, of stewardship, of love expressed through planning and sacrifice. In a society where individual desires often had to yield to the collective good, the ability of parents to secure a marriage that protected and strengthened the family was an act of devotion, a silent promise that they had done all they could to secure their children's future. As you breathe softly, let your mind drift to those quiet rooms where mothers and fathers sat by the glow of the hearth, discussing these futures with hope and fear, balancing the needs of the family with the fragile dreams they held for their children. Imagine the weight of the decisions they made, the care with which they measured each choice, knowing that a single miscalculation could bring hardship, while a well-made agreement could mean safety and stability in a world that offered neither freely. Sleep now, under the imagined glow of firelight, hearing the soft rustle of parchment, the quiet clink of coins being counted, the gentle murmur of voices planning futures in the hush of medieval night. These negotiations were the unseen threads that wove families together, the soft but strong fabric of hope in a world where every dawn brought uncertainty, and every promise carried the weight of love spoken not in flowers and poetry, but in the careful planning that said, "You will be safe." In the medieval world, a wedding could happen when a bride was as young as 12 or 14, marking the end of childhood in a moment as quiet as the closing of a door. It was a final step in promises made long before, agreements sealed in the hush of family conversations and the rustle of parchment, now coming to life in a ceremony that was both a celebration and a passage into a life of duty. Imagine a village dawn, mist rising over fields waiting to be plowed, dew glittering on the rough grass, and the church bell tolling softly across the quiet lanes. In a small cottage, a girl sits on a stool, her mother braiding her hair carefully, fingers working with quiet focus. Her wedding dress is simple, often just her best tunic freshly washed and brushed, perhaps adorned with a new ribbon at the neckline if the family could afford it. She is 12, maybe 13, and today she will be married. For many medieval families, the age of marriage was dictated not by readiness of the heart, but by the readiness of the body to bear children and the readiness of families to honor their promises. Girls were considered of marriageable age when they reached puberty, a sign not of adolescence but of womanhood, capable of carrying the next generation and continuing the family line. For the family, the marriage of a daughter meant one less mouth to feed and a strengthening of ties with another household, while for the receiving family, it meant an addition of labor, land, or dowry to help sustain the farm or business. among the nobility. The stakes were often higher and the ages similar. A noble daughter might be sent to her husband's household at 12 or 13, sometimes even earlier, to serve as a ward before the marriage was officially consummated. Her life would shift from the familiar halls of her parents' manor to the cold stone corridors of her new home, surrounded by strangers, expected to learn her duties, manage servants, and prepare for a role as a lady of the house. Her youth did not shield her from these responsibilities. It was assumed that she would grow into them as she grew into her new life. For the groom, too, age could be young, though often boys married slightly later, in their mid to late teens, once they could contribute to the household's labor or take on the responsibilities of a husband. Sometimes, in noble households, boys might be promised at a very young age but would not live with their wives until they were older, with the marriage formalized but not consummated until the boy came of age. These arrangements, while practical, were moments of change that children accepted as a part of the rhythm of life, just as they accepted the seasons and the cycle of planting and harvest. The wedding day itself was often simple among peasants but carried deep significance. The couple would stand at the church door, the priest asking for their consent, a formality that was expected, for refusing would bring shame to both families and disrupt the carefully laid plans that had been prepared for years. The community would gather, watching quietly, the ceremony as much of the village as for the couple, a reaffirmation of the bonds that held neighbors together, ensuring peace and cooperation among those who shared the fields, wells, and roads. After the vows, a small celebration would follow if the families could afford it. There might be bread, ale, and perhaps a bit of meat if the family was fortunate. Music played on a simple flute or fiddle, and dancing on the packed earth outside the cottage. Children would run about, chasing each other between the adults, while the newlyweds sat together, often shy and quiet, aware of the eyes upon them and the weight of the day settling around them like a new cloak. The first night, too, was often a communal affair in the sense that the community was aware of it, and in some traditions, the bedding of the couple was witnessed to ensure the marriage was consummated, solidifying its legitimacy. It was a practice rooted in the concerns of inheritance and the fear of disputed claims. But for the young bride, it was often a frightening and confusing moment, one faced with a sense of resignation and a quiet hope for kindness from the new husband. In noble households, the weddings were more elaborate, with feasts lasting for days the family could afford them, banners flying from the castle walls, and guests arriving from surrounding lands to witness the union that might carry significant political meaning. Yet beneath the banners and music, the reality remained the same. A young girl, often no older than a child, stepping into a role she did not choose, bound by duty to her family and the expectations of her station. These marriages, while young by modern standards, were seen as necessary, part of a world where life was uncertain and the need for alliances, labor, and the continuation of family lines could not wait. Families viewed these early marriages as securing the future, ensuring that promises were kept, alliances honored, and the fragile stability of their lives maintained in a world where war, famine, and disease could arrive without warning. For the children, marriage was not the culmination of a romantic courtship, but a transition they had known was coming, spoken of in soft voices in their homes, felt in the careful preparations of their mothers gathering dowries, and seen in the way their fathers shook hands with neighbors under the shadow of church porches. It was a passage from one stage of life to another, marked not by personal desire, but by the needs of family and the community that surrounded them. Yet, within this system, there were moments of kindness and care. A mother might slip her daughter a small token on the morning of her wedding, a piece of cloth embroidered with protective symbols, a small prayer whispered as she kissed her forehead. A father might place a hand on his son's shoulder, reminding him to treat his wife with respect, to remember the promises made before God and the community. Love, if it grew, did so within the walls built by these agreements, finding its place in the daily routines of shared labor, the quiet conversations at dawn, the laughter of children who would come to fill the home. As you rest, let your breathing slow and imagine the soft light of dawn in a medieval village, the quiet rustle of skirts as a young girl steps from her home for the last time as a daughter into a future that was promised before she knew what it meant. Imagine the gentle hush that falls over the gathered villagers as the priest lifts his hand in blessing, the soft murmur of prayers rising with the smoke from the hearths, the small moments of hope that parents hold in their hearts for their children's new lives. In this world, where the age of marriage was young and the burdens of adulthood came early, there was a quiet strength in the way family prepared. In a careful, loving way, they stitched futures together with dowries, land, and alliances, hoping that these threads would hold against the cold winds that swept across their world. Sleep now, letting the past drift softly around you, carrying you to a place where love was not expected on a wedding day, but where hope always was. Chapter 3. Weddings, Rituals, Ale, and Mixed Emotions. When dawn broke on a medieval wedding day, it did not break over flower petals scattered on polished floors or carefully choreographed ceremonies in warm chapels. It broke over muddy lanes, the smoke of cook fires, the nervous shifting of parents who had worked for years to bring this day to life. Village versus noble weddings differed in grandeur, but were alike in one essential truth. They were deeply communal, public events, binding not just two people, but two families, two networks of survival, and sometimes entire villages. In the village, a wedding day began early. Neighbors came by to help prepare, sweeping the packed dirt in front of the cottage, helping knead bread that would feed many mouths, lending a chicken or a few eggs to add to the meager feast. A girl, often barely more than a child herself, would have her hair carefully braided by her mother, sometimes adorned with simple ribbon or a borrowed piece of jewelry, a small luxury marking the importance of the day. The family might have saved a piece of fine cloth for her to wear, a tunic washed and brushed clean, carrying the scent of wood smoke and herbs. Outside, the groom would be preparing too, not with rings and small velvet boxes, but by ensuring that the arrangement of the day were in place. The ale barrels ready, the neighbor lending the flute or fiddle for music later, the animals secured, so the family could focus on the ceremony and the coming feast. His tunic would be clean, a belt tightened around his waist, a small token perhaps, a piece of cloth from the bride tied to his wrist, a reminder of the promise they were about to make. The village church was the heart of this moment. Small, cold, often dark even during the day. It was here that the marriage would be formalized before God and the community. The wedding often took place on the church steps, open to the sky, for it was essential that witnesses be present to confirm the vows. The priest would stand in his simple robes, lifting his hands in blessing, asking the couple if they came of their own will, a question that often held little real choice, but was spoken as part of the sacred order of the day. Behind the couple, family members would stand quietly, mothers clutching hands in nervousness, fathers watching with solemn pride, siblings peeking from behind skirts and cloaks, trying to understand the seriousness in the air. Villagers, too, would gather, for a wedding was a community matter. It marked a new household formed, new workers added to the fields, new alliances made that would help ensure cooperation when the harvest was ready or when sickness swept through the lanes. It was, in many ways, a promise not only between two people, but between two entire groups of people who depended on each other for survival. In noble households, weddings carried more pomp but echoed the same purpose. Banners bearing family crests would fly from castle battlements, signaling to all the union taking place within. Guests arrived on horseback, cloaks wrapped tightly around them, servants bustling to prepare halls that were often drafty and cold, even during summer. The bride, a young girl of 12 or 14, might be dressed in a gown her mother wore, now carefully altered and adorned with embroidery showing the wealth and status of her family. She would walk through stone corridors lined with watching eyes, each step echoing the weight of duty on small shoulders. The church ceremony in a noble wedding was grander, perhaps held in a private chapel with stained glass casting colored light on the stone floors. But the essentials remained the same: vows spoken before God and witnesses, a priest's blessing, and the solemn promise to honor the alliance made long before the bride could understand its meaning. Gifts would be exchanged, rings, cloaks, or symbolic objects like a piece of land or a written charter transferring property. These gifts were not tokens of romance, but markers of the economic and political agreements underpinning the marriage. Feasting followed in both village and castle, though the scale differed greatly. In the village, it might be bread, ale, cheese, and a bit of meat if the family could afford to slaughter a chicken or a pig. Neighbors would contribute where they could, and the air would fill with the sounds of laughter, the scrape of wooden bowls, and the notes of fiddle played by someone's uncle, while children danced in circles, skirts swirling in the dirt. The couple would sit together, shy, sometimes speaking quietly, sometimes simply sitting in the shared silence of two people stepping into the unknown together. In noble halls, feasting was elaborate, with tables laden with trenchers of meat, pies, and spiced wine if the family's wealth allowed it. Minstrels played and servants moved between guests, offering food while lords and ladies discussed alliances, land disputes, and the shifting current of politics that the marriage was meant to influence. The bride and groom, seated at the high table, were on display, symbols of hope for the future, but also visible reminders of the responsibilities they now carried. Yet, beneath the formality and the planning, weddings were human moments filled with mixed emotions. Joy, relief, fear, and the deep uncertainty of life about to begin all mingled in the air. A mother might smile at her daughter, pressing her hand gently before she stepped toward the church, but later turn away, hiding tears that came unbidden as she realized the child she raised was leaving her care. A father might stand proudly beside his son, offering him a quiet word of advice, remembering his own wedding day and the long years of work and partnership that followed. For the couple, weddings were often overwhelming. They knew each other in varying degrees, sometimes playmates from childhood, sometimes strangers seen only at the market or during church festivals. Now, they were bound together, expected to share not only work and household tasks, but the intimate spaces of life, to bring children into the world, to manage the small struggles of daily existence side by side. Love was hoped for, but it was not required. What was required was commitment, shared labor, and the silent acceptance of the path that had been set before them. As you let your breath slow, imagine these wedding days, not as grand scenes from illuminated manuscripts, but as quiet, chilly mornings in small villages, the warm breath of animals and byres, the nervous laughter of children peeking at the bride, the priest's voice soft yet firm as he speaks ancient words over two bowed heads. Imagine the hope that rose in the hearts of parents and neighbors alike, the gentle prayers whispered as the newlyweds stepped forward into a life of uncertainty and work, together. Sleep now, letting these moments settle around you like the soft hush of dawn, reminding you that weddings in the medieval world were not the end of a love story, but the beginning of a shared struggle for survival, marked by ritual, ale, and the quiet, complex emotions that come whenever people stand on the threshold of a new life, ready to step forward, hand in hand, into the waiting day. After the vows had been spoken before God and community, the medieval wedding flowed into its next chapter. Feasting, music, and dancing, all central to the ritual of marriage, pulling the entire village or the noble household into a shared moment of fragile celebration. For a moment, the harshness of medieval life eased. The relentless duties of tending fields, mending tools, grinding grain, and preparing for winter paused as neighbors gathered, not to mourn or to work, but to witness and share in a rare communal joy. A wedding was one of the few times in a year when ale might flow more freely, when bread might be set on tables in abundance, when laughter could ring across lanes that usually carried only the sounds of daily labor. In a village, the preparations for the feast began days before the wedding. Women gathered to bake bread, using precious flour saved for the occasion. If a family was able, a chicken or a pig might be slaughtered, providing meat that would be cooked slowly in iron pots, the scent of roasting filling the air, drawing children to peek into kitchens with wide eyes. Cheese, butter, and root vegetables from cellars might be brought forth, and neighbors contributed what they could: a jar of honey, a few eggs, herbs from a small garden, or simply their hands to help with the labor of cooking and serving. Ale, weak but warming, was brewed in advance, filling wooden barrels that were set out for the guests. The ale was more than drink. It was a symbol of a shared labored community, the effort of gathering barley, the careful tending of fires to boil the wort, the prayers that the brew would be good and ready for the day. A wedding feast without ale would have been unthinkable, a sign of misfortune, a shadow over what should have been a day of hope. The feasting was simple but joyous. People sat on benches and stools, sharing trenchers of bread, dipping them into pots of stew, tearing pieces of meat with callous hands, drinking deeply from wooden cups, the ale warming them against the cool drafts that slipped through the cracks of the cottage walls. Laughter echoed as stories were told. Sometimes stories of other weddings, or tales of the bride and groom as children, moments of harmless teasing that allowed the community to share in the transition from youth to adulthood. Children darted around the tables, their laughter rising like birdsong, reminding everyone that life, for all its harshness, still carried moments of lightness. In the corner, someone might take up a fiddle or flute, the first soft notes coaxing feet to tap against the earthen floor. Music, though simple, transformed the space, pulling people into movement, letting them step out of the way to daily survival for a few moments of swirling skirts and stamping boots. Dancing was not an elaborate performance, but a communal joy. Men and women formed circles, clapping in rhythm, stepping in simple patterns, the music quickening, laughter breaking out as someone stumbled, only to be pulled back into the rhythm by a neighbor's steady hand. For a brief time, there was no lord or serf, no division between rich and poor, but a circle of people moving together, bound by the same air, the same dust rising from the floor, the same fleeting hope that the future might hold gentler days. In noble households, the feasting was grander, the tables longer and heavier, set with trenchers and goblets, with servants moving constantly to refill cups and bring forth steaming dishes of spice meats, pies filled with fruits or meats, and bread freshly baked in large ovens. Minstrels played more complex melodies, their songs carrying the weight of old stories of kings and heroes, of saints and battles, woven into the sounds of the feast. Guests would drink wine and ale, toasting the young couple, sometimes with loud voices that carried a mix of genuine joy and the sharp edge of politics, reminding everyone that even in celebration, alliances and rivalries simmered beneath the surface. Yet in those halls, filled with torchlight flickering against stone walls, the air heavy with the scent of roasting meat and sweet spices, there was also laughter, the same shared humanity that rose in the simpler cottages of the peasants. The bride and groom, whether in the village or the castle, often sat quietly during the feast, overwhelmed by the attention, the expectations, and reality of the commitment they had made. Sometimes they would exchange small, shy smiles, uncertain of what words to speak, aware of the eyes upon them. Other times, they would remain silent, lost in thoughts of the unknown future, of the work ahead, of the children that would soon be hoped for by families eager to see the marriage bear fruit. The feast, though joyous, also carried an undercurrent of tension. For families who had sacrificed much to prepare the wedding, there was hope that the marriage would secure a future, that it would not falter under the weight of misfortune. For the community, the wedding was a reminder of the cycles of life, of the births, marriages, and deaths that marked the passage of time, of the fragility of each hope placed upon the shoulders of the young. As the feast ended, the music softened, the guests drifted away, and the newlyweds were left to step into their shared life, the last embers of the fires glowing in the darkness. For some, love would grow in the quiet moments of shared work, in the laughter of children born into the household, in the silent prayers whispered over planting fields in spring. For others, the partnership would remain practical, a necessity in a world that offered little room for dreams. As you close your eyes, let the warmth of these feasting halls and village cottages settle into your mind, the soft glow of torches and hearths, the laughter that rose against the fear of winter, the music that swirled around tired feet, giving them strength to dance. Remember that in a world defined by labor, scarcity, and the constant presence of uncertainty, the wedding feast was a rare promise of abundance, a fragile hope shared by all who gathered to witness the union. Sleep now, letting the sound of soft music and laughter carry you into dreams where bread is warm, ale is shared, and the cold night air carries the promise that even in hard times, there can be moments of light, moments of dance, moments of quiet celebration that remind us what it means to belong together in the flickering warmth of a medieval feast. If you imagine weddings as a triumph of love's journey, a moment where two hearts finally meet under flowered arches, then the medieval reality may feel like a cold splash of dawn water. In many medieval marriages, couples were often strangers, or at best, only vaguely acquainted before they stood together before God and the community to become husband and wife. For those living under thatched roofs with earth floors and smoky hearths, the path to marriage was not paved with whispered promises under moon, but with years of family planning and silent acceptance. A girl might see the boy she would marry at the market, perhaps glance across the church during Mass, or exchange brief words when neighbors helped each other with harvest or repairs. These moments were often fleeting, surrounded by the watchful eyes of parents who understood the stakes involved in even the smallest sign of familiarity. A peasant girl, 13 or 14, standing at the church door on her wedding day, might feel her heart pound not with the excitement of love, but with the fear of stepping into the unknown. The boy beside her, barely a man, might feel the same, though he would try to stand firm, aware that the eyes of his father, uncles, and neighbors were on him, expecting him to be strong, to take up his role as a husband and provider. They were, in many cases, strangers bound together by promises made long before they understood what those promises meant. And yet, the expectation was clear. They would live together, work together, share the burdens of tending animals, planting fields, hauling water, and, in time, raising children who would continue the cycle. Among the nobility, the distance between bride and groom could be even greater. A young noble woman might be sent to a husband's household in a region she had never seen, among people she did not know, carry with her the weight of family honor and the fragile hope of a peaceful alliance. The husband, often older and deeply aware of the political consequences of the marriage, might meet his bride for the first time on the day of the wedding or shortly before, as negotiations concluded and preparations were made. Their marriage would be witnessed by lords, knights, and clerics, the union sealed with rings, gifts of land, and public declarations that carried far more weight than the soft words they might share in the brief moments alone that followed. The bride would leave protection of her family, crossing thresholds of stone and custom into a new life, tasked with learning how to manage the household, command servants, and bear children to secure the lineage. In neither peasant cottages nor grand castles was love a necessary component of the union. Affection was hoped for, but the absence of familiarity was not considered a tragedy. It was simply the way of things. A marriage was an agreement, a joining of resources, labor, and lineage, upon which survival and social stability rested. The young couple's feelings were secondary to the needs of family and community, to the fields waiting to be worked, the animals needing care, the alliances requiring maintenance. Imagine now the small moments of quiet that came after the feasting, when the music had faded and the guests had gone home. The newlyweds, often shy, would find themselves alone together for the first time, the hush of the cottage or the grand, cold stone chamber surrounding them. For some, there might have been a hesitant conversation, an exchange of small stories or quiet laughter breaking the tension. For others, there might have been silence, each feeling the heavy weight of expectation pressing down as they stepped into the unknown reality of their new lives. The first night of marriage, expected to be the consummation of the union, was often a moment of fear and confusion, particularly for young brides who had received little preparation beyond quiet warnings from mothers or aunts. In some communities and noble households, the bedding was a public event witnessed by family members or trusted attendants to confirm the marriage's validity. This practice, while invasive to modern sensibilities, was rooted in the practical need to prevent disputes over inheritance and legitimacy, the fear of future claims that could unravel alliances and cause conflict. Yet, even within these stark realities, there were moments of kindness and small mercies. A groom might offer gentle reassurance to a frightened bride, aware of her youth and inexperience, choosing patience over force. A bride might find in her new husband a partner who, despite being a stranger, became a companion in the harshness of medieval life, sharing the daily burdens, working beside her in the fields, comforting her during illness or loss. Over time, for many couples, the strangeness of the early days softened into familiarity. A young couple might discover companionship as they learn to manage a household together, to keep the hearth burning through long winters, to bring children into the world and raise them through the sicknesses and uncertainties that marked medieval childhood. Shared labor and shared hardship often wove bonds stronger than the fragile hopes of romance, forging partnerships rooted in necessity and endurance. For some, love did grow, blossoming quietly in the cracks of hard days, in the laughter shared over a meal after long hours in the fields, in the quiet prayers whispered together in the cold dawn before work began. It was a love born not of choice but of circumstance, a love that found its place within the practical structure of medieval marriage, where affection, if it came, was a blessing rather than an expectation. And yet, there were also marriages that remained cold, marked by distance and duty, with a partnership never softened into friendship, where the burdens of survival overshadowed any chance of tenderness. For women, in particular, The risk of violence, neglect, or abandonment was real, and the protections offered by family and the church were often limited by the realities of social and economic power. These unions were a reminder that marriage in the Middle Ages was a gamble, its outcomes determined by the personalities of the individuals and the circumstances that shaped their lives. As you rest, let your mind wander to these quiet medieval nights, to the hush that falls over a village after a wedding, the soft crack of the hearth as two young people, strangers until this day, sit together, uncertain but bound by vows spoken under the watchful eyes of neighbors and God. Imagine the small, hesitant conversations, the nervous glances, the quiet acceptance of new reality, the unspoken hope that kindness might grow where love did not yet exist. Sleep now, letting the past drift around you like a gentle mist, carrying you into dreams where the hush of medieval night holds a promise of endurance, of finding connection even in the spaces where love was not the reason for union, but where sometimes it found a way to bloom despite the hard soil of necessity. In the medieval world, the witness bridal bed was more than a strange ritual. It was a powerful social safeguard, a final, sometimes uncomfortable step to confirm a marriage's legitimacy in a world where inheritance, alliances, and family honor depended on the certainty of a union's consummation. Imagine a cold stone chamber in a castle, torches flickering against the damp walls, casting shadows on worn tapestries. Or a small village cottage, the scent of rushes and wood smoke in the air, the flicker of a single candle illuminating the straw mattress laid neatly in a corner. In both places, the bride and groom, often young and uncertain, would find themselves at the center of tradition that blended practicality with ceremony. The witness bridal bed varied by region and social class, but its essence remained. The community, or at least a few trusted witnesses, needed to see evidence that the marriage had been physically completed. In some noble houses, attendants would escort the couple to bedchamber, priests offering blessings, family members following with laughter and loud encouragement, attempting to mass attention with jokes and music. They might stay until the couple was in bed, sometimes throwing stockings or garters as symbols of fertility, before finally leaving them alone. In other cases, the bedding could be more intrusive. Witnesses might remain in the room, separated by a curtain, or wait just outside to hear signs that the marriage was consummated. In some traditions, the bed linens would be examined for proof of virginity, a detail considered essential for noble marriages, where questions of lineage and inheritance were intertwined with political alliances. This proof, while humiliating for many women, was seen as protection against future disputes, ensuring that children born of the marriage would not have their legitimacy questioned in times of inheritance claims. Among peasants, the practice was simpler but still public. Neighbors might escort the couple to bed, offering coarse jokes and blessings, the laughter carrying the nervous hope that the marriage would be fruitful, bringing children who would help tend fields and care for parents in their old age. It was a moment when the private became public, a recognition that the union was not merely for the couple's benefit, but for the community's stability, ensuring that the promises made during the wedding ceremony would result in the continuation of families and the workforce needed for survival. The bedding was not merely about tradition or prurient curiosity. It was rooted in the practical fears of the medieval world, where disputes over land and titles could lead to bloody feuds, where alliances built over years could crumble if a child's legitimacy was questioned, where the fragile balance of survival could be shattered by a single dispute over inheritance. By confirming the consummation, the community and family could rest with a measure of certainty that the marriage was valid, that future children would have the unchallenged right to inherit, and that the promises made between families would hold. For the couple, the experience was often a mixture of fear, confusion, and resignation. A young bride, barely into her teens, might enter her wedding night with little understanding of what was expected of her, guided only by whispered warnings from mothers or older sisters, carrying fears of pain, of failing to meet expectations, of the unknown. A young groom, equally inexperienced, might feel the weight of duty pressing heavily, the knowledge that his role was to secure the marriage and fulfill the expectations of his family and community. Yet within these moments, there could also be small gestures of kindness. A gentle word from the groom, an attempt to ease the bride's fears, a mother's quiet blessing whispered before leaving the room. These moments of humanity could soften the harshness of the tradition, turning a moment of anxiety into the tentative beginning of companionship. The practice of the witness bridal bed also reflected the medieval view of marriage, not as a private affair, but as a public contract. Just as weddings were conducted before the eyes of the community, the bedding was part of the collective investment in the union's success. The community had a stake in ensuring that marriages were stable and that children born within them were accepted without question. The strength of the village or household depended on clear lines of kinship and cooperation. This collective view of marriage extended to the expectations of fertility. Children were not only the fulfillment of family hopes, but essential contributors to the household economy. A marriage that did not produce children could lead to social and economic instability, prompting further community involvement. With neighbors offering herbs and prayers, midwives advising on remedies, and families quietly pressing for signs of pregnancy. The witness bedding was the first step in this expectation, a public acknowledgement that the couple was now part of the cycle of life that sustained the community. For noble families, where inheritance could determine the fate of estates and influence the politics of entire regions, the need for certainty was even more pronounced. A noble woman's virginity was tied to her family's honor and to the legitimacy of any children she bore. The bedding ceremony, uncomfortable and invasive as it was, served as a shield against future disputes, allowing families to defend the legitimacy of heirs in courts or during conflicts, pointing to the public confirmation of the marriage's consummation as evidence of its validity. As years passed, couples who began as strangers in these ceremonies often grew into their roles, learning to navigate the challenges of married life together. The memory of the witness bridal bed, for some, remained a point of embarrassment or quiet humor in later years, while for others, it was simply one more tradition in a life marked by rituals designed to protect families against the uncertainties of the world. As you lie quietly now, letting your breathing slow, imagine the soft hush that would fall after the laughter and music faded, the hush of a medieval night settling over cottages and castles alike, the flicker of a single candle casting shadows on walls, the quiet murmur of a prayer, the rustle of straw as a young couple lay side by side for the first time, strangers brought together by family promises, community expectations, and the unspoken hope that kindness and partnership might grow in the spaces where fear and uncertainty lingered. Sleep now, letting these images drift through your mind, the weight of the past settling softly around you, reminding you that in the medieval world, even the most private moments were woven into the fabric of the community, part of the shared responsibility of ensuring that families endured, that promises held, and that within the quiet and the fear, there was always a hope that tomorrow would come, bringing the dawn light over fields and villages, over young couples learning to build a life together, step by quiet, uncertain step. Chapter 4. Love comes after marriage. Married life in the Middle Ages. In stories today, marriage is often the conclusion, the kiss under the arch, the promise of happily ever after. But in the medieval world, marriage was never the end of the story. It was the beginning of shared life focused on childbearing and unending work, a quiet, daily rhythm in which love, if it came, was a small candle flickering in the drafty corridors of duty. Imagine a small cottage at dawn, the roof thatched, the floor packed earth, the air filled with the soft sounds of a hearth stirring to life. A young wife, barely into her teens, rises in the cold before the sky had begun to pale, pulling a ruffled shawl around her shoulders as she stirs the ashes to coax a flame to life. A young husband, perhaps only a few years older, pulls on boots stiff with use, preparing to tend the animals before the day's labor in the field begins. This is a rhythm of medieval marriage. No soft lingering, no shared morning tea, but a partnership marked by the immediate demands of survival. For most medieval couples, marriage was first and foremost an economic and social contract. The expectations were clear. The wife would manage the household, tending the hearth, preparing food, caring for children, and sometimes helping with planting or harvest. The husband would work the fields, mend fences, and manage dealings with landlords or village matters. Each had a place within the fragile structure of family and community, and within that place, they learned, slowly, the art of living together. Childbearing was central to this shared life. A wife's ability to bear children was often seen as the measure of marriage's success, for children were both blessing and necessity. They were the labor force of tomorrow, the helpers who would one day care for aging parents, the assurance that the family's small patch of land would remain in the family's name. A wife who bore many children was praised for her fruitfulness, while a wife who could not conceive might face quiet sorrow, whispered prayers, and in some cases, the threat of repudiation. The medieval home was filled with the sounds of children, the cries of infants, the laughter of toddlers, the quiet whispers of older children learning prayers or chores. These children were woven into the fabric of daily work. A mother might nurse a baby while kneading dough, instructing a small child to fetch water or sweep the hearth. A father might pause in his plowing to help a child catch a frightened chicken, or teach an older son how to mend a fence. Parenthood was not separate from the labor of survival. It was part of it, a cycle of care and work that defined family life. Love, in the tender, romantic sense, was rarely the foundation of these marriages, but that did not mean that affection could not grow. A husband might learn to admire his wife's strength as she managed a household during his absences, or her quiet courage during childbirth. A wife might find comfort in her husband's steady presence, in the way he protected the family's interests, in the rare but significant moments of shared laughter when work paused. Love, when it came, was a soft warmth that grew quietly in the cracks between necessity and exhaustion. But the reality was not always kind. The demands of childbearing took a heavy toll on women, with frequent pregnancies and the constant threat of complications or death in childbirth shadowing the promise of new life. Work was relentless, and seasons of poor harvest could bring hunger that pressed heavily on families, testing the fragile bonds between husband and wife. Disputes over money, land, or family obligations could strain the partnership, and in some households, violence was a grim reality, with few avenues for a wife to seek protection. The church's teachings emphasized the husband's role as the head of the household, but also reminded husbands of their duty to care for their wives and children with fairness and compassion. In practice, however, the balance of power within the household varied greatly depending on personalities, family circumstances, and community norms. Some couples managed to build relationships rooted in respect and cooperation, finding moments of peace amid the endless labor of their days. The medieval household was often multi-generational, with in-laws, siblings, and extended family sharing living space. A young wife might find herself under the watchful eye of a mother-in-law, expected to learn household management while respecting the authority of the older woman. A young husband might live with his parents, working the family's land under the direction of his father until he can inherit or establish his own household. These layers of family life added complexity to the marriage, creating spaces for support, but also for tension. Seasonal rhythms shaped the couple's shared life. Spring brought planting, a time of intense labor and hope, when every hand was needed in the fields. Summer required tending crops, maintaining animals, and preparing for the harvest. Autumn was a culmination of these efforts, the rush to bring in grain, preserve food, and prepare for winter. Winter was a time of repair and reflection, of mending tools, spinning wool, and surviving on the stores carefully laid by during the year. These cycles repeated year after year, marking the passage of time, the growth of children, and the slow aging of the couple. Within this cycle, festivals and holy days offered moments of respite. A village feast, a saint's day, or a market day allowed couples to step briefly out of routine, to share in community celebrations, to dance or sing, to visit family in neighboring villages. These were the moments when a partnership, built on daily toil, could find space for small joys, for the shared glances that spoke of companionship, for the laughter that reminded them they were still human in a world that often demanded they be only laborers and parents. As you let your breath slow now, imagine the quiet hush of a medieval cottage as dawn begins, the soft sound of fire catching, the small movements of a couple preparing for another day of work. The young wife ties her hair back, checking on the children sleeping nearby, while the young husband sharpens a blade before stepping out into the cold morning air. There is no dramatic decoration of love, no soft music rising in the background, but there is a promise unspoken that they will face the day together. Sleep now, letting these images drift around you, the quiet promise of dawn, the rhythm of shared labor, the hope for a harvest, the soft sound of children breathing in the darkness. In this world, love was not always a reason for marriage, but it could become its reward a warmth that grew slowly within the partnership, a comfort that made the relentless cycle of medieval life a little softer, a little kinder, as two people learned to live and endure together, day by quietly turning day. If medieval marriage was a contract first and a partnership second, it was also a partnership often marked by long absences, as husbands left home for war, trade, or seasonal service, leaving wives to manage household alone under the unblinking watch of the seasons and the village's quiet judgment. Imagine a woman standing in the doorway of a timber-framed cottage, the dawn mist curling around her skirts as she watches her husband walk down the dirt path, a bundle of tools or a spear strapped across his back, the road ahead uncertain and long. Perhaps he is headed to serve as lord in a local conflict, or to join a levy summoned for the king's campaign, or to work in distant fields or forests for wages that will pay rent and buy salt for winter. She stands there a moment longer, arms wrapped around herself, before turning back inside to the small children who wait for breakfast, to the fire that needs stoking, to the animals that need feeding, and to the endless list of tasks that will not pause for her loneliness. For many medieval wives, the absence of their husbands was a regular rhythm of life. In peasant households, men might leave during harvest seasons to work as hired laborers on larger estates, bringing in the coin needed to pay rents and tithes. In the winter, some might travel to nearby towns for carpentry or weaving work, sleeping on straw floors in crowded lodgings, sending home whatever small wages they could spare. Others joined merchant caravans, transporting wool or grain to market towns, gone for weeks at a time as roads wound through forests and over hills, dangerous with bandits or sudden storms. Among the nobility, husbands were often gone for war or to attend courts, summoned by the shifting politics of the realm. A noble woman might spend months, sometimes years, managing estates in her husband's absence, overseeing tenants, collecting rents, ensuring the fields were plowed, and settling disputes among villagers who worked the land. She might send letters carried by slow, uncertain messengers, letters that could take weeks or months to reach a husband who might already have moved on to another castle, another battlefield, another uncertain place under the cold medieval sky. In these absences, wives became the heads of their households, bearing the weight of decisions that could shape their family survival. They managed stores of grain, decided when to sell livestock, negotiated with neighbors, and ensured children learned the prayers and skills they would need to contribute to the household. They fixed thatched roofs, oversaw the brewing of ale, and tended small gardens that kept vegetables on the table during lean months. They faced sickness alone, childbirth alone, and the fear of losing children to fevers or accidents without the comfort of a husband's hand to hold in the dark hours of the night. And always, there was the waiting, the quiet moments in the evening when the children were asleep, when the fire burned low and shadows gathered in the corners of the cottage or manor hall, when a woman might sit with her hands in her lap, listening for footsteps that would not come that night. She might whisper prayers, lighting a small candle before the image of saint, hoping for her husband's safety, hoping that the coins he earned would return with him, that he would return whole, uninjured, and that he would still look at her with warmth despite the time and distance between them. For some, these separations became the way of life, a cycle of parting and returning that shaped a marriage. The return could be awkward, the husband a stranger in his own home, the wife changed by the quiet strength built during his absence. Children might cling shyly to a father they barely remembered, and routines might shift as the couple relearned how to share the duties that had long fallen to one alone. For others, the return was a moment of fragile joy, a brief pause of togetherness before the next absence called them away again. These absences also affected the power dynamics within marriage. A wife managing the household in her husband's absence could develop a quiet authority, respected by neighbors who saw her competence, and by children who learned to turn to her for decisions. Some women gained reputations as wise managers, skilled negotiators, and respected members of community, a respect that might continue even after the husband returned. For others, the authority was temporary, dissolving upon the husband's return, as the household slipped back into the expected hierarchy of medieval society. Among the nobility, long absences could also bring challenges to loyalty and trust. Letters were slow and rare, and rumors traveled faster than truth. A woman managing an estate might find herself the subject of gossip, her actions scrutinized, her interactions with stewards and clerics questioned by those eager to find fault. A husband might return to find disputes over rents or land use, arguments that could strain a marriage already stretched by distance. Yet, noble women who managed estates successfully were often praised for their intelligence and steadfastness, proving themselves capable of protecting family interests in a world where politics and property were deeply intertwined. In the village, the absences of men meant that women formed networks of quiet support, helping each other with harvest, with childbirth, with the endless labor of survival. A neighbor might help prepare a fence, bring food to a woman who had fallen ill, or watch children while a mother worked in fields. These networks were essential, the invisible threads that held communities together, ensuring that no family stood entirely alone, even when the men who provided physical labor and protection were far away. And so, medieval marriage was often a partnership lived in parts, with husbands and wives learning to trust in each other's absence, to hope for the safe return that would reunite the family, to accept that their bond would be tested by the demands of war, trade, and survival. Love, in this reality, was a quiet endurance, a promise that lived in small gestures, in the careful preservation of food for winter, in the letters written on scraps of parchment, in the mending of clothes worn thin by travel, in the prayers whispered into the night. As you close your eyes now, imagine the quiet roads of the medieval world, winding through forests and fields, carrying husbands toward uncertain futures, while wives stood in doorways, watching until they were gone. Imagine the soft hush of a cottage at night, the quiet determination of a woman tending a hearth while her children slept, her thoughts of a man walking under distant stars, her hopes as constant as the turning of the seasons. Sleep now, letting these images drift around you. The quiet promise of return, the gentle resilience of women who bore the weight of absence, the soft strength of marriages that endure distance, silence, and the slow passing of time. In the medieval world, love was not a constant presence, but it could be a quiet promise, carried in the small acts of daily survival, waiting patiently for the footsteps that would one day return home. When you think of love within marriage, you might imagine soft conversations at dawn, quiet gestures, small smiles exchanged across a shared table. But in the medieval world, love was something that might blossom after the vows were spoken, but often it did not, leaving marriages cold, strained, or simply practical arrangements focused on survival. Imagine a medieval couple waking in the cold darkness before dawn, the air heavy with the scent of smoke and damp wool, the thin light of a tallow candle flickering as they dress for another day of labor. The husband pulls on boots cracked by use, prepare and tend animals, or walk the fields to check for damage from last night's frost. The wife stirs the embers in the hearth, adding small sticks until the flame grows enough to warm the room for the children who will soon rise, sleepy-eyed, to another day of chores and lessons. Between them, there may be a glance, perhaps a word, or perhaps nothing at all. This is how many medieval marriages function. Partners in the work of survival, bound more by duty than by warmth. In some marriages, affection did grow over time. A husband might come to respect the quiet strength of his wife, seeing the way she managed the household during his absences, the way she bore children and raised them with care, the way she managed resources so the family could survive harsh winters. A wife might come to appreciate her husband's steady labor in the fields, his efforts to protect the family's interests, his small gestures of consideration, such as bringing in wood for the hearth before dawn or checking the roof for leaks before the winter rains came. These small moments could become the foundation for a tender partnership, a quiet love born from shared hardship and mutual reliance. But for many, love never found foothold. The demands of daily survival left little space for tenderness, and marriages often remained emotionally distant, with conversations limited to practical matters, harvest debts, repairs, the needs of children, the requirements of landlords, the obligations of the church. Affection, when it existed, was expressed in small, infrequent gestures, a hand resting briefly on a shoulder, a shared smile at a child's mischief, a loaf of bread set aside for the other when food was scarce. For many, these small gestures were enough, soft lights in the dimness of a hard life. Some marriages remained marked by conflict, resentment, and, at times, violence. A husband frustrated by poverty or disputes with neighbors might take his anger out on his wife, who had few protections or recourses beyond the church's limited intervention, or the quiet support of female relatives and neighbors. A wife might feel trapped in a marriage that brought her constant pregnancies and unending work without kindness, living with a man she had never chosen and would never truly know. Her life marked by the harsh rhythms of childbirth, child rearing, and the endless cycle of household labor. The church taught that husbands should love and care for their wives, and wives should obey and support their husbands, creating a partnership that reflected the divine order. In practice, the balance of power often rested with the husband, though practical necessity meant that many wives managed significant aspects of the household and family economy, making decisions about food storage, the sale of surplus produce, and the care of animals and children. In these spaces, a wife could exercise quiet authority, shaping the family's well-being even within the constraints of her role. Love, when it grew, was often born in the small, practical spaces of life. A husband returning from weeks away for seasonal labor might bring a small gift, a ribbon, a piece of fruit, a story from a distant market. And the wife, tired from the burden of managing alone, might feel a moment of gratitude, a flicker of warmth that softened the distance between them. A wife recovering from childbirth might receive gentle care from a husband who sat by the hearth, watching over her and the newborn, his callous hand resting on her arm as she drifted into exhausted sleep. These moments could build a quiet affection, a tenderness that strengthened over years of shared hardship. But for many, marriage was simply a partnership of necessity, an arrangement to ensure survival, to produce and raise children, to keep land tended and households functioning. In these marriages, love was not expected, and its absence was not seen as a failure. Marriage was not about happiness in the modern sense, but about stability, continuity, and fulfillment of social and economic obligations. The emotional distance was often accepted as part of the order of life, as natural as the turning of seasons or the ringing of the church bell calling the community to mass. The medieval community played a role in these marriages, observing the couple's interactions, offering support during illness or childbirth, sharing in the burdens of labor during harvest, and sometimes intervening when disputes became too severe to ignore. Neighbors and family members were witnesses to marriage's daily reality, seeing both its moments of quiet partnership and its tensions, understanding that marriage was a complex and often imperfect institution that nonetheless formed the backbone of society. Among the nobility, marriages were often even more emotionally distant, shaped by politics and alliances, with husbands and wives spending long periods apart as men attended courts or campaigns and women managed estates. Affection might develop over time, but many noble marriages remained formal and cold, with emotional lives lived outside the marriage through friendships, religious devotion, or in some cases, extramarital affairs that brought their own risks and complications. Yet even in these cold marriages, there were moments of connection, a shared concern for a sick child, the planning of a feast or religious observance, the joint management of disputes with tenants or neighbors. These shared responsibilities could create a sense of partnership, a bond rooted in the reality of life's demands rather than the softer desires of the heart. As you rest now, let your breathing slow. Imagine the quiet of a medieval night, the flicker of a candle in a small cottage, the distant sound of animals settling for the night, the soft breathing of children sleeping on straw pallets nearby. Imagine a husband and wife sitting across from each other, sharing a simple meal, their hands rough from labor, their eyes tired but calm. There is no grand declaration of love, but there is a shared purpose, a quiet promise that tomorrow they will rise again to face the demands of their world together. Sleep now, letting these images of medieval marriage drift around you, understanding that in this world, love was a quiet, fragile possibility, not a guarantee. It might come, growing slowly in the spaces between labor and silence, or it might not, and the marriage will continue nonetheless, held together by duty, necessity, and the unspoken hope that, even in a world without guarantees of happiness, there could be small moments of warmth, small moments of grace, that made the burdens of survival a little lighter, a little softer, as two people move through their days, side by side, into the quiet dawn. In the medieval world, domestic violence and marital conflicts were a grim reality for many couples, cast in the shadow of a society that saw marriage as a duty and stability as paramount, often leaving women with few protections and even fewer choices when kindness was absent within the home. Imagine a small timber cottage, smoke curling from the hearth, the dawn air cold as frost clings to the grass outside. A woman moves quietly, stirring the embers, preparing the morning meal, glancing toward the corner where her husband's boots are placed, braced for the sound of his waking. She moves with care, each motion measured, knowing that a misplaced word, a clatter of a pot, or a complaint about the shortage of flour might bring a sharp word or a rough hand. This was the daily reality for many medieval women who lived within marriages where the line between partnership and oppression was often determined by the temperament of their husbands and the constraints of their world. The church taught that husbands should treat their wives with fairness, that marriage was a sacrament in which both partners had duties to God and each other. Sermons were preached about the virtues of patience and kindness, about the responsibilities of husbands to care for their wives and to avoid cruelty. Yet in practice, the enforcement of these ideals was inconsistent, shaped by local customs, the influence of families, and the often indifferent attitudes of local authorities who viewed domestic disputes as private matters. A woman facing violence within her marriage could seek help in the church courts, presenting her case to priests or bishops, sometimes bringing witnesses to speak of bruises or injuries, of nights spent fleeing to a neighbor's home for safety. The church might admonish the husband, imposing penance, requiring promises of better behavior, and in some cases, granting a separation of bed and board, a form of legal separation that allowed the woman to live apart while remaining married. But the church rarely granted annulments or divorces, and the practical difficulties of living separately often forced women to return to their husbands, hoping for change that seldom came. Among the peasantry, village communities sometimes intervened informally, neighbors stepping in to calm disputes, family members warning men against excessive cruelty that could disrupt the fragile harmony of the community. A brother or father might confront a man who beat his wife too harshly, not necessarily out of concern for the woman's suffering, but out of fear that her inability to work or care for children would burden the extended family. Yet, many women endured violence in silence, bearing their pain quietly as they continued to cook, clean, care for children, and manage the household, knowing that their survival depended on maintaining the marriage. Economic dependency made leaving nearly impossible. A woman without her husband's protection faced a world where she had little claim to property, limited means to earn a living, and the constant threat of social stigma. Even if she returned to her family, she brought with her the shame of failed marriage, the risk of conflict between families, and the burden of additional mouths to feed in households already stretched by scarcity. For many, it was safer to endure, to find moment of peace when tempers cooled, to pray for patience and strength, to survive within the boundaries of the life they were given. Marital conflict was not always violent, but could take the form of coldness, neglect, or emotional distance that left women feeling isolated within their own homes. A husband might drink heavily, spending what little money the family had on ale at the tavern, returning home with empty hands and sour words. A wife might withdraw into silence, performing her duties mechanically, her spirit dulled by the relentless grind of labor and childbirth, her hopes of tenderness or partnership fading with each passing year. Children bore witness to these conflicts, growing up in households where arguments and anger shaped the rhythms of daily life, learning early the cautious silences that might keep the peace, the careful avoidance of topics that could ignite a father's temper. The cycle of hardship often repeated itself as sons grew into men shaped by what they had seen, and daughters stepped into marriages with a quiet fear that their own lives would mirror those of their mothers. Yet, within these harsh realities, there were moments of resilience and quiet strength. Women found small spaces of power within their households, managing resources with skill, caring for children with tenderness, supporting each other through networks of female friendship and kinship that provided emotional and practical support. They shared herbs and remedies for bruises and pains, offered shelter during moments of fear, whispered prayers together, and sometimes, in rare moments, confronted injustice as a collective, reminding the community that a household's stability depended on a measure of peace within its walls. In noble households, the dynamics were different but not free from conflict. A noble woman might find herself trapped in a cold, strategic marriage, her days spent managing estates under the watchful eyes of stewards and advisors, her husband absent for long periods at court or war. Disputes over property, dowries, and alliances could create tension, with arguments playing out in the cold halls of stone manors, under the gaze of servants and children who watched and learned the fragile dance of power within the household. Some noble women wielded significant influence, using their management of estates and social connections to assert their authority, but they too could face the threat of violence or coercion from husbands who saw their wives' independence as a challenge to their control. Legal options existed for noble women, who could appeal to higher courts or seek intervention from powerful relatives. But the process was slow, fraught with political risks, and often did not result in meaningful change. As you close your eyes now, letting your breathing slow, imagine the quiet of a medieval village at night, the soft glow of hearth fires behind shuttered windows, the distant sound of a dog barking, the rustle of wind in the thatched roofs. Within these cottages, marriages played out in all their complexity, some warm, many cold, some marked by quiet partnership, others by conflict and fear. Imagine the women who rose each dawn to tend to children, to prepare meals, to mend clothing and to care for animals, carry within them the weight of unspoken hopes for kindness, for patience, for moments of peace. Imagine the small, quiet act of resistance and resilience, a mother singing softly to a child while she worked, a neighbor offering a loaf of bread to a woman who had gone hungry, a sister's comforting hand placed gently on a trembling shoulder. Sleep now, letting these images drift softly around you, understanding that in the medieval world, love was often a fragile possibility overshadowed by the harsh demands of survival, that kindness could be a rare blessing, and that within the quiet resilience of women enduring hardship, there was a strength that helped keep families and communities alive day after day, dawn after quiet dawn. Among the stories whispered on cold medieval nights, tales of elopement and defiance shimmered quietly, like rebellious sparks against the dark mantle of duty and arranged marriages. These stories, though rare and often ending in hardship, carried a haunting beauty, reminding listeners that even in a world bound by land, dowry, and family alliances, the heart sometimes dare to choose its own path. Imagine a small medieval village, the dawn mist curling low over the thatched rooftops, the church bell ringing softly to mark the hour of morning prayers. In one cottage, a young woman, barely 15, wraps a bundle in a rough cloth, bread, a small piece of cheese, and a single ribbon her mother gave her on her last name day. Her heart pounds as she glances back at her sleeping family, the familiar shapes in the half-light, the scent of smoke and wool that has wrapped her since birth. She steps out into the cool air, where a young man, a farmhand, waits for her, shifting nervously, knowing that with each moment they stand there, they move further from the safety of family and closer to an uncertain future. Stories like these spread through villages, carried in cautious whispers and curious glances. A girl who ran away with a boy she loved, rather than marrying the widower chosen for her, became the subject of gossip, warnings, and sighs of secret envy. Some saw her as foolish, risking her security for feelings that could not fill bellies or pay rents. Others saw her as brave, willing to follow her heart in a world that told her she had no right to her own desires. But such choices came at a cost. Families who had negotiated marriages to secure dowries or merge lands viewed elopement as a betrayal, an act that could fracture delicate alliances and bring shame upon the household. A daughter who fled risked being disowned, cut off from protection and support her family, left to rely entirely on a young man who had promised her love, a promise that could be tested harshly by hunger, sickness, and the weight of survival. Communities might ostracize couples who defied arranged marriages, seeing them as a threat to the social order, as their actions challenged the system upon which everyone's security was built. In some cases, the church would intervene, seeking to regularize the union if it was clear that the couple had married willingly. A priest might perform a quiet ceremony in a small chapel, offering the sacrament of marriage to legitimize the union, protecting the couple from accusations of sin or scandal. But even with the church's blessing, the practical challenges remained, as the couple often faced life with no dowry, no property, and few resources, relying on the kindness of distant relatives or the chance of work in another village. The tales of such couples were remembered, woven into the oral histories of communities. They became lessons as much as stories, warnings wrapped in romance, reminders that love was powerful but could not replace bread on the table or shelter from the winter winds. Yet they were also a testament to the human spirit, the quiet yearning that existed even in a world shaped by duty, reminding listeners that the heart could still dream, even if the price of that dream was high. In rare cases, these elopements led to quiet, enduring partnerships. A young couple, having defied their families, might find work on a distant manor, laboring side by side in the fields, raising children in a small rented cottage, building a life from nothing but their shared determination. These stories, too, became part of village memory, a gentle counterpoint to the tragedies, a reminder that while love could not guarantee an easier life, it could bring companionship, shared laughter, and the comfort of knowing that the person beside you was there by choice. Among the nobility, such defiance was even rarer and carried greater risks. A noble woman who fled with a knight or squire risked not only her family's wrath, but political consequences that could lead to bloodshed. Land titles and alliances were tied to her marriage, and an elopement could unravel years of careful negotiation, bringing ruin upon families and domains. Such stories, when they occurred, were often ended by force, the couple captured, the young man imprisoned or executed, the woman returned to her family, and sometimes forced into a convent to remove the scandal from public view. Yet, these stories, too, were remembered, becoming part of the fabric of medieval romance literature, transformed into legends that blurred the line between cautionary tales and quiet yearnings. Ballads were composed about knights who rescued ladies from unwanted marriages, about lovers who braved forests and hostile lands to be together, about tragic endings that cemented their love in memory, untouchable by the world harshness. The power of these stories lay not only in their drama, but in what they represented to people who heard them. They were reminders that love, even in a world built on practicality, was a force that could not be entirely silenced. They allowed people to dream, to sigh softly by the hearth as they listened to tales, imagining what it might feel like to be chosen for love rather than dowry, to be wanted for the heart rather than the land or alliances one could bring. Yet, as the stories ended, listeners would return to their lives, rising at dawn to fetch water, to tend animals, to walk beside husbands chosen by parents in contracts. The stories were a momentary escape, a flicker of what could be, before the practical demands of the day reclaimed their thoughts and hands. As you close your eyes now, letting your breathing slow, imagine the quiet roads of the medieval countryside, winding through misty fields and forests, carrying two young people who had chosen each other, stepping into the unknown as dawn rises pale above them. Imagine the soft hush of a village at night, where stories are told in low voices, where mothers and fathers glance at each other, remembering their own youth, while children listen with wide eyes, holding the stories close in the quiet hope that perhaps, one day, they too might find a love worth risking everything for. Sleep now, letting these stories settle around you, as gentle as a dawn mist, as quiet as the first bird song, reminding you that even in a world of harshness and duty, love was a small, defiant flame, burning softly in the hearts of those who dare to choose, even when the world told them they could not. While rare love stories whisper hope in the medieval world, courtly love tales among the nobility shaped a unique vision of romance, a structured, often unattainable, and carefully performed dance of longing, chivalry, and poetic devotion that rarely translated into marriage, but left a deep imprint on medieval imagination. Imagine a grand hall in a stone castle, banners hanging from the rafters, the scent of rushes and smoke thick in the air as a fire crackles in the hearth. A troubadour begins to sing, his lute echoing softly, telling the tale of a noble knight who pledges his loyalty to a lady fair, vowing to serve her with courage and faithfulness, to perform deeds of valor in her name, to carry her favor, perhaps a ribbon tied to his arm, as he rides into tournaments or battlefields. This was a world of courtly love, a cultural ideal that emerged in court of southern France and spread across Europe, giving rise to countless poems, songs, and stories. It was not love rooted in the practical needs of marriage, land, or alliances, but an idealized, often secret admiration, usually for a lady who was married to another, creating a tension that was celebrated in verse, but fraught with danger in reality. Courtly love emphasized emotional devotion, secrecy, and the testing of the knight's loyalty through quests or acts of bravery. A knight might spend years serving a lady, hoping for a single smile or a brief word, viewing her as an embodiment of virtue and beauty. The lady, in turn, might offer small tokens, a glance, a kind word, a piece of embroidery, encouraging the knight's loyalty while maintaining her honor within the strict codes of her marriage and society. These relationships were, in many cases, more literary than literal, a form of social play that allowed the expression of emotion within the rigid structures of noble life. They offered an escape from the harshness of arranged marriages, the coldness of political unions, and the relentless duties of managing estates and producing heirs. In a world where feelings were often secondary to duty, courtly love allowed emotions to exist, even if only in the realm of song and poetry. Yet, the ideals of courtly love were not without complications. While many such relationships remained chaste and poetic, others crossed into affairs that brought scandal and conflict, leading to feuds between families, disputes over honor, and the risk of violence or political fallout. The story of Lancelot and Guinevere, the knight who loved King Arthur's queen, stood as both an ideal of love and a cautionary tale of the destruction such passion could bring to kingdoms and friendships. For the noble woman, participating in courtly love could offer a rare sense of admiration and worth beyond her role as wife and mother. It was a space where her beauty, intelligence, and virtue were praised, where she could exercise social influence by rewarding or denying a knight's devotion, and where she could experience the thrill of being desired, even if she could not act upon it. For the knight, it was a way to channel feelings that could not be fulfilled within the confines of marriage, allowing him to serve, to admire, and to express his hopes in poetry and song. The church often viewed courtly love with suspicion, seeing it as a potential pathway to adultery and sin. Preachers warned against the dangers of letting the heart stray from duty, reminding men and women that their first loyalty was to God and their spouses. Yet, the songs continue to be sung, and the poems continue to be written, for they fulfilled a need within society, a longing for beauty, emotion, and connection in a world where marriage was often devoid of warmth. Courtly love shaped the ideals of chivalry, influencing how knights viewed their roles not just as warriors, but as protectors of women, defenders of virtue, and seekers of honor. Tournaments became stages where knights displayed their skill and courage, often dedicating their victories to the ladies they admired, adding a layer of romance to the otherwise brutal reality of medieval combat training. For those outside the noble courts, these stories filtered down in simplified forms, becoming part of the ballads sung in village squares, the tales told during winter gatherings. Peasants and townsfolk listened to these stories with a mixture of fascination and distance, aware that such ideals belonged to a world far removed from their own marriages of practicality and survival. Yet, even in the simplest cottages, a young girl might dream, for a moment, of being admired as the ladies in songs were, and a young man might imagine himself a knight, brave and true, earning the favor of a woman whose smile could light his world. Courtly love did not change the realities of medieval marriage, but offer an emotional escape, a small window through which people could imagine a different kind of connection, one where the heart led rather than duty. It influenced the literature, art, and even the social customs of Europe, leaving a legacy that would shape how love was viewed long after the medieval period ended. As you let your breathing slow, imagine a quiet evening in a medieval manor, a fire burning low as a noble woman sits in a high-backed chair, a piece of embroidery in her lap, listening as a visiting bard recites a poem of a knight's devotion. The words fill the room with soft music, the flicker of the fire catching the thoughtful glint in her eyes, as for a moment, she allows herself to wonder what it might feel like to be loved so deeply, so fiercely, in a world where her worth was often measured by land, alliances, and heirs. Sleep now, letting these stories of courtly love drift around you like the soft strumming of a lute, reminding you that even in a world bound by duty and necessity, the longing for love and beauty found a voice, however fleeting, in the songs sung under stone arches, in the whispered verses shared in torchlit halls, in the quiet dreams carried into the dawn. While courtly love tales and whispered elopements offered glimpses of longing, the role of minstrels, poets, and oral tradition ensured these rare stories of love were preserved and shared, comforting and stirring the medieval imagination even in the hardest times. These stories became soft lanterns carried from hall to hall, from hearth to hearth, reminding people that love, rare as it was, still flickered in the world. Imagine a winter night in a medieval village, the air sharp with cold, the stars bright over the thatched roofs, the breath of animals steaming in the byre, and the hush of snow muffling the sounds of the world. In a small cottage, the family gathers around the hearth after the evening meal, the fire crackling low as children press close, seeking warmth. Into this hush steps a traveler, a wandering minstrel with a lute slung across his back, the scent of road dust clinging to his cloak, eyes bright with the stories he carries. He sits near the fire, tuning the strings of his lute, his fingers rough but sure, and he begins to sing. The room stills as his voice rises, telling the tale of a lady who dared to love a knight despite her father's harsh command, of a knight who carried a token for his love into battle, surviving wounds and storms to return to her side. His words weave through the smoky air, carrying images of moonlit gardens, secret meetings, and stolen glances that warm hearts tired from a day of unending labor. These minstrels were the carriers of love stories, blending history, legend, and imagination, turning rare acts of defiance into ballads that would be sung in taverns and village squares for generations. They made heroes out of young couples who fled arranged marriages, transforming their fear and poverty into tales of courage and devotion. They sang of queens who loved knights, of shepherd girls who won the hearts of lords, of tragic endings that were mourned, and of happy reunions that offer hope. Even when their stories spoke of heartbreak and ruin, they did so in a way that allowed listeners to feel the power of love, to sigh softly, to imagine for a brief moment what it might be like to choose whom to love in a world that seldom allowed it. For peasants who rose each day to toil in the fields, these stories were moments of respite, a small spark of beauty and emotion in lives marked by survival and duty. In noble courts, poets and troubadours performed similar roles, entertaining lords and ladies with verses crafted to honor the ideals of chivalry and love. Courts competed in patronage, rewarding poets who could craft the most stirring verses, whose songs could move a lady to tears or inspire a knight to feats of bravery. The courts of Eleanor of Aquitaine and the troubadours of Provence created a culture where love was celebrated in words, even as it remained rare in practice. Manuscripts containing these poems and songs were copied and passed from hand to hand, adorned with illustrations of knights kneeling before ladies, of lovers exchanging tokens, of secret letters written by candlelight. The pages carried not just words, but the dreams of those who read them, dreams of a world where love was possible, where devotion was rewarded, where tenderness could exist alongside duty. These stories also shaped the ideals of love for generations to come. Even in arranged marriages, couples might recall the songs they had heard, the verses they had read, allowing small gestures of affection to bloom. A husband might remember the tale of a knight who treated his lady with kindness and strived to offer the same. A wife might recall a poem describing a lady's quiet strength and carry herself with a similar dignity, even within the confines of her expected role. The stories became teaching tools, passed from parents to children, from elders to the young, reminding them of the dangers of reckless love, but also of its beauty. A mother might warn her daughter about the hardships of elopement, using the tale of the tragic ballad as caution, yet her voice might soften as she described the bravery of the lovers, acknowledging the power of the heart even as she counseled obedience. A father might remind his son of the importance of loyalty and honor, using the stories of knights and their beloveds to illustrate courage, not only in battle but in how one treated others. In churches, the clergy often sought to temper the influence of these love stories, reminding congregations that true love was found in the partnership of marriage under God's guidance, not in the passionate, dangerous affairs sung of in ballads. Yet even priests could not silence the power of these tales, which continue to echo in markets, during festivals and around winter fires, carried by the voices of those who long for beauty in a world that often demanded silence. The minstrels and poets did not create love in the medieval world, but they preserved its memory, allowing it to exist in the realm of imagination. They gave people words to express what they might feel, even if only in the quiet of their hearts. A wife who found kindness in her husband might remember a line from a song and feel warmth. A young man about to marry a woman chosen for him might recall a verse about gentle devotion and decide to treat her with respect, allowing affection to grow where none was expected. As you let your breath slow, imagine the soft glow of fire in a medieval hall. The hush as a minstrel begins to sing, his voice weaving stories into the air, stories that drift upward to rafters, carrying dreams of love, of hope, of quiet courage. Imagine the faces of those who listen, the way their eyes reflect the flames, the way they lean forward, holding these words close, letting themselves believe, if only for a moment, that love might be possible, even in a world where so much was chosen for them. Sleep now, letting these stories settle softly around you like a warm blanket, reminding you that in the medieval world, love stories, rare, fragile, and often tragic, still found a way to live, carried in songs and poems, in whispered tales and quiet dreams, offering a small, comforting light in the long night of duty and survival. Asterisk. And so, as the medieval world turned beneath cold stars and the weight of duty, rare stories of love, of whispered promises, of minstrel songs, of quiet glances by hearthlight, reminded people that even in a life ruled by survival, the heart could still stir. These tales did not erase the hardships of arranged marriages or the demands of endless work, but they offered a gentle light, a moment to sigh and dream, before dawn called everyone back to the fields, to the loom, to the tasks that never ended. Love was rare, often fleeting, sometimes dangerous, but it was never fully extinguished. It lived in soft songs under castle arches, in the hush of village nights, in stories passed from mother to daughter and father to son. It lived in the small kindnesses between strangers who became partners, in the hope that affection could grow where none was expected. Once again, if you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so we have more motivation to produce better quality products. And sleep now, knowing that in a world of rigid expectations, these rare love stories offer quiet promise that even where life was hardest, the human heart could still find a way to dream, and in those dreams, find a soft, comforting peace.